Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History U.S. Government Edition. In this video, we're going to explore the kinds of people who have historically fought for civil rights in our country. Now, don't get confused. When I say civil rights, we tend to, in normal conversation, use that as a synonym for civil liberties, but they are not the same thing. Civil liberties are those rights guaranteed to us in the Bill of Rights. But civil rights are about equality and protection from discrimination. And so in this video, we're going to look at the 6 different groups of people who have fought for their rights in America, and we're going to see the progress they have made. Let's get to it. Right out of the gates, the first thing I need to tell you is that the Constitution nowhere mentions equality, and nor does the Bill of Rights. But that does not mean equality was not on the minds of the founders. Just recall that magnificent phrase from the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And look, I know all too well that that notion of equality was probably pretty pinched and very narrow, because it really only considered guys like me who are land-owning white guys. Is that a good band name? No, that's a terrible band name. And so when Thomas Jefferson said that all men are created equal, it's obvious that he was leaving out large swaths of American humanity like women and slaves and Native Americans and non-landed whites. And because of that, it's the outrage du jour to poo-poo that phrase in the Declaration of Independence and accuse the founders of being bigoted white supremacist chauvinists. Now, I know that nobody watching this video would fall into such undisciplined thinking, but for all those other people out there, let me explain. Look, I agree that Jefferson's notion of equality was narrow, but when he wrote those words, he was writing something beyond his own notion of equality. And I say that because every one of those marginalized groups that I just mentioned, when they wanted to claim their civil rights, what they did was they claimed those words. They didn't just throw them out, they claimed them as their own, and they won their inclusion by them. Okay, so all of that by way of introduction. Now let's look at the 6 groups in American history who have traditionally claimed those words for their own and won their inclusion. First, African Americans. So in 1619, a Dutch ship pulled into the harbor at Jamestown, and this wasn't an unusual occurrence. Ships docked there often to engage in trading and commerce, but on this ship was something new for the colony. It wasn't selling tobacco, it wasn't selling sugar. The merchants on this ship hawked flesh. And so on that day, the people of Jamestown brought 20 African slaves into the colony, the first slaves purchased in the colony, and that was the beginning of a long and tragic tale for black people in the South. Now, it didn't take long before the Southern economy was absolutely dependent on slave labor, and by the 1860 census, almost half the Southern population was slaves. And when we think about these Southern slaveholders, we can't be simplistic in our thinking. Don't take the easy way out and just dismiss them as bigoted and wicked. I mean, they were both, but don't suppose that you and I are altogether different from them. And here's what I mean. In 1860, the per capita income for a Northern worker was $2,000 a year. In the South, the per capita income was $4,000 per year. So think about that for a moment. Even those slaveholders who thought that slavery was immoral, and they certainly existed, could not easily abide abolishing slavery unless they simultaneously wanted to think of impoverishing themselves. And if you were put in that same position, I would think you'd at least be tempted to make some of the same decisions that they did. And now it's time for a disclaimer. Things I did not just say. Slavery is good. Southern slaveholders were upright, moral citizens. I didn't say any of that. Just want to cut off the outrage before it starts. And we're back. So it probably goes without saying that there were some pretty hefty tensions between the North and the South on this issue. And those tensions eventually led us to the Civil War, in which 520,000, give or take, Americans were killed in this cause. But even so, the Civil War settled the slavery issue once and for all. And the manner in which we cemented our convictions on this issue was through constitutional amendments. 3 of them, to be exact. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to former slaves and extended to them equal protection of the law. And the 15th Amendment granted freed slaves voting rights. And you would think that with all that progress, the newly freed black population of the South would be rejoicing, but they were not. You see, after the war was over and these new constitutions were in effect in the South, federal troops were sent to make sure they were enforced. And for a while, it was fine. But then 12 years later, the federal troops were removed and Reconstruction ended. And as a result, the black population of the South was severely disenfranchised, and that means they were barred from exercising the rights that they had been given. For example, in order to keep black people from voting, some southern states administered literary tests that were extremely difficult. And if you didn't pass, you didn't vote. And these tests were so difficult that even much of the white and educated population could not pass them. And as you can imagine, that won't do. So they enacted the grandfather clause, which basically said that if your grandfather voted in this state before the war started, then you could too. And I don't think I need to tell you how many black grandfathers voted in the southern states before the war. And so all of this virtually eliminated the black vote in the South. But don't worry, it gets worse. Once the federal troops withdrew, many southern states enacted black codes, or what was known as Jim Crow laws. And essentially these laws completely segregated white people from black people in every possible form. For example, interracial marriage was outlawed. Blacks and whites had separate hotels, separate schools, separate elevators, separate water fountains, separate bathrooms. And when this disgraceful situation finally came before the Supreme Court in 1896 in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson, the court actually upheld segregation as long as the separate facilities were equal. And truthfully, for the next 60 years, there wasn't much progress on the civil rights front for blacks. But then the 1940s arrived. In 1947, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And in 1948, President Truman passed an executive order to desegregate American troops. And that sets us up for the early 1950s, in which the Supreme Court hears the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education, which overturned the separate but equal doctrine of Plessy versus Ferguson and ordered the desegregation of public schools. But we're going to save that for another video. Now let's look at the second group who has fought for their civil rights in America, namely Native Americans. Now in the Constitution, Native Americans have 0 rights. So it's not surprising when we see things like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, in which the 5 civilized tribes of the eastern United States were forcibly removed from their land and made to settle in the Oklahoma Territory. In all, the American federal government signed 371 treaties with the Native Americans. And you know how many of them we broke? 371. But through organized pressure from the Indians, America granted them citizenship in 1924. And then in the 1960s, they fought for even greater rights and were granted the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968. And in this act, many federal protections were extended to them along the lines of the Bill of Rights. The third group who have historically fought for civil rights are Latinos. And the largest population of Latinos, especially Mexicans, live in the Southwest. And they've had a long experience of prejudice and discrimination there. And one of the major victories in fighting for their rights was under the leadership of a guy named Cesar Chavez. He organized farm workers in the 60s and the 70s in order to demand better working wages and working conditions, and they won. The fourth group of Americans who have historically fought for their civil rights are Asian Americans, and the most significant groups are the Chinese and the Japanese. The first wave of Chinese immigrants came with the 1848 gold rush, and once all the easy-to-find gold was picked clean, the Chinese were systematically driven out. So then they found work building the transcontinental railroad, but there they experienced increasing discrimination and violence. And finally, we get the crowning achievement of their discrimination, which was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which barred Chinese immigrants from becoming American citizens. Okay, now how about the Japanese? Well, unsurprisingly, there's a huge population of Japanese Americans on the western coast of the United States. And keep this in your mind for just a second. When I say citizens, I mean they were actually American citizens. And so when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the federal government decided to round up all the Japanese in America and send them into concentration camps in the western interior. 110,000 American citizens were placed into these camps because they were of Japanese heritage. And the fifth group of people who have fought for their rights here in America are women. So on the eve of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, Abigail Adams, who is the wife of founder John Adams, wrote this to her husband: "Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." You taste that sauce? Well, as it turned out, Adams did not listen to his wife, and women were hardly considered for civil liberties at all. I mean, women didn't even get the right to vote until 1920 in the passage of the 19th Amendment. I mean, think about this for just 1 second. Before 1920, the only people in America who did not have the right to vote were as follows: criminals, idiots, lunatics, and women. I mean, that's crazy. Like, before 1920, women could not bring a lawsuit in their own name. They couldn't hold public office, but they did fight for their rights and they did win. And the final group who has fought for their rights in our more recent history is the LGBTQ community. So for most of US history, if somebody was openly gay, that meant you could get arrested or even lynched. But then in 1969, the gay rights movement began in New York City. The gay community there was tired of being harassed by the police, and so they reacted in 3 days worth of resistance and rioting. And those 3 days really galvanized the gay community to seek out their proper rights. And over time, the federal government has recognized the legitimacy of this community's demands more and more. And probably the crowning judicial achievement of this community, the one of which they are most proud, is the Supreme Court case Obergefell versus Hodges. And it was in this case that the Supreme Court legalized homosexual marriage in all 50 states. Okay, those are the 6 different groups of people who have fought for civil rights here in this country. Those groups of people who claimed Jefferson's words that all men were created equal and said, that belongs to us too. I'll see you next time. Alright, thanks for watching. If you like civil rights, click that like button. If you don't like people having civil rights, then click that thumbs down button twice. Trust me, you'll like it. And if you're in an AP government class and need help mastering the skills and content of AP government so you can get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam, then subscribe and I will help you along. Bye.